Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on improving decision-making in schools by Keith Radley. Before I introduce our presenter today, I'm just going to go over a quick couple of reminders to please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole presentation. We'll have about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for a question and answer session. So if you have a question you would like to ask, please feel free to use that in the chat box. And if you're comfortable, please feel free to turn on your video. Our presenter today is Keith Radley. Keith Radley is an associate professor and director of the school psychology program at the University of Utah. Dr. Radley's research interests center on the application of behavioral interventions within academic settings, particularly for individuals with developmental disabilities. Further, his research focuses on data collection, visualization, and analysis in research and applied contexts. So we're so excited to have you here today, Keith. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Annie. It is certainly a pleasure to be here and to be doing a webinar with y'all today. So I will go ahead and just get started. Pull up. All right. So like Annie said, the focus today is going to be on decision making in schools and really setting professionals up, inclusive of school psychologists, counselors, social workers, teachers, administrators, anyone to be able to make good, valid, and reliable decisions based on data that they've collected in a school setting. Equally, these same principles, I think, can be applied to non-school-based settings, but we're primarily going to kind of couch this in the framework of schools, but certainly is applicable elsewhere. So Annie had kind of given you a brief rundown of myself. Here I have, maybe a little bit more about me, much of what Annie already shared. In addition to this, and I think maybe the most important thing to know about me is that I am a pizza enthusiast. I love pizza. There aren't going to be many pizza references in the webinar today. I'll spare you from that. But we'll go ahead and hop right in. What I'm going to be talking about today is part of the research that I and particularly some colleagues at the University of South Florida conduct under kind of this umbrella called the Basics Lab, which is really focused on evaluating behavior analytic interventions and supporting decision-making in schools. So to looking over everyone that's in the webinar, I recognize, I think everyone here, but I wanted to maybe do a little thought experiment with us for a second. And I would like you to think of a title or a word that you would use to describe your relationship to schools or training. So for example, I might describe myself as an associate professor. So, think about a term that you feel like would capture the essence of what you do in schools or your relationship to students or maybe this broader field of education. And if you just want to drop that in the chat once you've kind of thought of. And I think this is kind of challenging. I like hunters, helper, advocate. I like that one, Jana. Trainer, school psychologist. Thanks, Aaron. I think it's hard to kind of define ourselves really narrowly. Mental health and behavioral support provider, coach, consultant. These are all great terms. Thank you to everyone that is participating in this. And not that we necessarily have to define ourselves by a single role. I think that's certainly not how we really function in schools. I think more often we're like Swiss Army knives and we do a whole lot of different things in a school. But in thinking about your role, and we'll move on to this next slide, how many of you had the thought of researcher pop into your heads? Maybe some of you, but hopefully by the end of this, at least, you will be conceptualizing yourself as a researcher in schools. And I think we should all have that as part of our identity in schools, because essentially, like we'll see, we are doing research and solving problems much like we would in a very, research context. So when we talk about school-based practice and effective supports for children and adolescents in schools, whether those are focused on, challenging behaviors or mental health, or, teacher implementation of interventions or well-being, whatever that is, all school-based practice should be data-based. I think that's a principle that we could all agree with. We should have data to inform the decisions that we're making. And again, whether that is about school-wide systems, whether that's an individual student or a classroom, we should be making decisions based on data. And in thinking about school-based practice and data-based practice, the word data is in there. So we can't have database practice without this element of data, right? So by definition, we need to be collecting some sort of data in order to engage in database practice. And because of this, because we should be looking for data and collecting data and actively thinking about how we collect data, I think we can very clearly define all of your roles as a researcher. It is applied research. So looking at this and thinking about if you have completed some type of formal research project, whether that's a thesis or dissertation, whether you have worked on a publication or whatever that might be, there is a pretty clear research process. And most of us probably learned this in like 4th or 5th grade when you begin science fair and you learn about the scientific method. And we do that same thing at the university level when you have a thesis or dissertation, an honors project, whatever that might be. And it roughly follows something like this. So you have a research question, you come up with a hypothesis about your research question, and you design a study around that to be able to answer that hypothesis. And then once you have a design, you go and you collect data, and then you decide whether your hypothesis was correct or incorrect, right? We probably all did this as 4th, 5th grade science fair students. And we continue to do this today. So now think about school-based practice and what you do in a school on a day-to-day basis, or when you're interacting with students and teachers. You probably have a referral problem or a concern that's brought to you. So you have a student that is disruptive or struggling academically, or is experiencing, social, emotional, mental health concerns. You have a teacher that's struggling, a school with, systems that are in need of support. So you have a question that's brought to you, and then you define goals and essentially hypotheses to say, I feel like if, these things were changed, or if this was implemented in such a way, we might anticipate a change in this particular outcome. So we implement an intervention, and then we go and ideally we're collecting data and returning to our original hypothesis, or kind of that intended goal of the intervention, to see if what we had predicted actually occurred. And this is really critical. And even though I think we could all support that this is, ideally how school-based practice works, I think this is often a really challenging part of school-based practice, that we implement great systems, but then when it comes time to verify that systems are running smoothly, it becomes more of a challenge to identify what data we should be looking at, how frequently we should be collecting data, whether we're even collecting the right data or not to be able to make an informed decision. So again, just laying these out side by side, I really think these processes are really one and the same. They are, different in terminology and in context, but really those procedures, whether you are in a research context or in a school-based applied setting, the procedures for implementing an intervention, collecting data, and evaluating that should be the same. So everyone, by this definition, in a school building, I believe, is a researcher, whether you are a general education teacher, a special education teacher, a counselor, a psychologist, a social worker, whoever you are in that school building, you are a researcher and are engaged in research on a daily basis. So in kind of thinking about, maybe the ideal process of how we would go about evaluating or planning applied research and interventions in schools. First, we could consider this step of identifying a problem, right? And when we look back in the behavioral consultation step, this is like, or the behavioral consultation literature, this is really the first step in a problem solving process. We look to, what is going on? What are the concerns? Develop definitions of what our concern is. We might consult literature, and I think broadly we can consider literature, even things like, courses that we've taken, content we've been exposed to. We could consult with colleagues. There's lots of ways in which we could get empirical data. We do have to be, I think, careful. There are lots of sources of, intervention supports. In one of my classes, I like to pull up like a screenshot from Pinterest, and they have lots of interesting behavior management ideas on there. Pinterest probably not the most like empirically rigorous site to be finding information about interventions, but it's out there. And then this is really critical. And in thinking from an intervention implementation perspective, planning for all of these steps, and particularly planning for data collection, is really important. So at the outset, figuring out how are we going to determine whether our intervention was effective. And that should be a priority from the very first day of identifying and defining a problem. So then ideally we're coming up with a solution and using that empirical literature to find a strategy that we could use. And then, just like a researcher, really try to set up a scenario in which we can determine whether it was our intervention that is supporting student behavior change or whether it was potentially something else. And that's really hard in a school setting. It's much easier in a research context where we might be able to control things really tightly. But in a school setting, kids are exposed to different things outside of their classroom. There are lots of things that you don't have control over as a school professional, but to the extent possible, we want to make sure that our measurement system and our intervention is set up so that we can be, very certain that it is our intervention that is producing behavior change, and not that, the student is just getting, older and it's maturation and they're naturally getting better at a particular skill or something like that. And then the final step, problem evaluation. We need to collect data just like we planned for and determine if the data that we are collecting matches our hypotheses that we originally made. So if we anticipated that our intervention would, improve academic performance, or reduce teacher stress, or decrease disruptive behavior in hallways, whatever that might be, really evaluate our data in light of the hypotheses that we made. And in doing that, it's also really critical to determine if what we had planned and the intervention that we now have data on, that intervention was implemented with integrity and fidelity. There's what I consider kind of a seminal article by Frank Gresham, who is, I think, one of the real leaders in behavioral school psychology. And they talked about the importance of intervention integrity in determining if your intervention was ultimately effective. And if we are lacking that piece of data, it makes it really hard to identify what Gresham and colleagues, deemed kind of functional relations, and that these two things are actually related to each other. So really in schools, that is critical. If we have, for example, a student who is receiving an intervention to support academics and math, but the intervention wasn't quite implemented as we intended it, we suddenly don't know at the end if the intervention was bad or if the intervention was unsuccessful, or some combination of the two. So that piece of fidelity and integrity is really, really critical in making good decisions in schools. All right, so in that problem identification step, we talked about operationally defining a behavior. And this is, I think, where it all really starts. Ogden Lindsley in the 60s came up with this term for determining whether something is a behavior or not, and really helping us define behaviors. And Lindsley called it the dead man's test. And he had this kind of funny saying that went along with it. If a dead man can do it, it ain't behavior. And I think this is really critical in thinking about behavior change in schools and how we define behavior of students, or, if we're talking about school-wide supports, really carefully defining what it is that we're looking for. So we won't go through this whole exercise. I do this with one of my classes. We have a variety of things up here that may or may not be behaviors. And we'll just take one, for example. We'll take John Krasinski from A Quiet Place, and the behavior of being quiet. And this is something that I think we see a lot in schools. We have behavior plans that are maybe targeted for students being quiet, or being less disruptive. And when we apply Lindsley's dead man's test to this, it kind of fails that definition. Dead people are exceptionally adept at being quiet, ideally, right? So we would say that doesn't pass kind of this baseline level of what we should be targeting and what we should be defining as behaviors in a school. Alternatively, if we had a student that was being really disruptive, we could instead say, being actively engaged in your math assignment, right? Now that is a behavior, and that would be a behavior that would pass Lindsley's dead man's test, right? A dead person could not, actively be working on a math worksheet. So we should really be focusing first in behaviors that are observable and that require action, and not just kind of passiveness. Okay. And that's really important in developing interventions that will be effective, and also using data effectively. In relation to that, and I'm not sure who maybe first came up with the term the stranger test. This is also really important. When we're coming up with definitions of behavior, they should not only pass the dead man's test, but we should define them in such a way that someone unfamiliar with the student, if we wrote that description down in the behavior, they could go into the classroom and immediately recognize if the behavior is occurring or not. So if I said something like disruptive behavior, that's what I'm interested in this particular classroom, I could go in and possibly for me, disruptive behavior encompasses a certain set of behaviors that a student may demonstrate. Maybe for another student or another professional, they go in and they classify disruptive behavior differently than I do. So ultimately, to use data effectively, we all need to be on the same page in terms of what these data represent. And again, we need to come up with behavioral definitions that are complete and that pass the stranger's test. So you could write it down and someone could immediately recognize what that is. And ultimately, that allows us to have definitions of behavior, which lead to data that are easily quantifiable. They're easily measurable. They allow for valid and reliable evaluation over a long period of time. We're not worried if someone's going to come in and get different data than the data that you're getting, and ultimately allows us to make good, defensible decisions. So even before we get to the point of collecting data, this is leading us to making good decisions. And in thinking about collecting meaningful data beyond what we already talked about in defining behaviors in a really discrete and comprehensive way, ultimately we need to be focused on this, that data should be objective, and passing the dead man's test and the stranger test certainly help that way. We should also be focused on collecting data in a manner that is free of bias and prejudice. And that is really critical. And that requires us not only to define behaviors in such a way that, pass the dead man's test and pass the stranger's test, but also that are framed within kind of a sociocultural context and represent a broader understanding of those elements that are influencing student behavior. So that requires us to meet with stakeholders and not necessarily just teachers, but members of the community, caregivers, family members, to develop good definitions of behaviors that again are valid and also free of bias or prejudice. And like we said earlier, ultimately our goal is to create a definition of behavior where observation can be reliable and consistent over time and really truly represent the behavior of a student in a meaningful way. So now that we kind of get through this process of defining a behavior, we get into questions of measurement. And again, these should be questions that we ask at the very beginning instead of saying, all right, we're going to implement this plan, let's go. And then, trying to build the airplane as you're flying and figuring out, oh, well, how do we measure our impact on this? So before we even get to implementing intervention, we need to have good plans for data collection. And we have really two ways in which we can measure behavior. We can do it in an indirect manner, which involves a higher degree of inference, and potentially some low latency. We could have people complete things immediately, or does it involve direct measurement strategies in which there is really low latency? We're looking right at a behavior. We're not asking to make subjective judgment what behavior occurred or not. And there's various. We'll briefly discuss those. So indirect tools, there's a lot of different ways in which we can collect data in an indirect manner. And indirect tools are great because they're really efficient. They require relatively fewer resources and dedicated observers to collect data. Typically, tools can be things like checklists or rating scales or behavior contracts in which someone is kind of thinking back about a behavior that occurred and rating the extent to which that occurred. So we might ask a teacher, over this entire day, how on task was this student? How actively engaged were they during, this period or this day? Other indirect tools we could consider are things like discipline referrals. Those are things we could go collect at a later point in time. They are, in some way kind of a rating of student behavior and, in relation to teacher tolerance for challenging behavior. There's certainly some well-documented limitations with regard to discipline referrals, but those things are out there and frequently used as ways to determine whether interventions are effective. So again, we'll just do kind of a brief kind of thought experiment, and you can do this yourself. When we're thinking about indirect kind of rating scale types of assessments, we could apply those to a broad class of behavior. So taking something, for example, like academic engagement. We could ask a teacher to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how academically engaged was a student for that day. Okay. And, there's a good degree of research to suggest that teachers and other raters, when presented with a 1 to 10 scale, are reasonably accurate in about 20% or so either way in rating a student behavior. And we could apply that to really a wide variety of behaviors. So social interactions and pro-social behaviors, using language that a school might determine was inappropriate. We could apply that in a lot of different ways. Now, as an alternative to those indirect measures in which we're having someone, think back and rate some behavior as it occurred, we could also collect data in a more direct way. And this might include, taking like a frequency, a tally every time a student, demonstrates some behavior. If it was aggression, the number of times which they turned and hit a peer, the number of math problems completed, the number of times they, demonstrated a social initiation with a peer. We could, tally those and come up with some measure of how frequently a behavior is occurring. We could time a behavior and see how long it's lasting. So if a student was out of their seat, or if they were engaged academically, how long of a period were they demonstrating that behavior? In some ways, we could measure things like intensity. This, I think, maybe a good example would be like yelling or noisy classroom behavior. You could have a decibel meter and you could measure the intensity of noise in that classroom. With intensity, not that we have the tools necessarily to be able to do this in a school, but you could measure, like with aggressive behavior, how hard someone, punched a peer, and things like that. So the amount of, force behind a behavior. And then latency is this idea of how long between some signal to do something and the behavior occurring what's the time elapsed. So a teacher says, all right, class, time to get your math book out. How long does it take for all of the students in the class to get their math book out? And we could measure the amount of time that it took from that signal to actually getting math books out. So again, we'll let you do a lot of this on your own. We won't do all of these, but for something like talking out, we could measure how many interruptions a student demonstrated during a class period, right? So how many times they interrupted the teacher without raising their hand. We could measure the amount of time that they were talking out over a class period. We could do the same thing with things like hitting peers, following through with teacher directions. There's a variety of really direct ways which require you or someone else as an observer to be present, looking at that student and taking data really in real time. And when we talk about direct strategies, we should ultimately consider these the gold standard. They really remove a lot of inference because we're not asking individuals to remember back to when a behavior occurred and say, oh, were they on task about 50% of the time? Because we have data. You were sitting there watching the student taking data the entire time. So it's ideally, more representative of actual student behavior than a indirect measure might be. However, because of that, they are really resource intensive. They require that dedicated observer to be watching the student. So as a way of kind of lessening that demand on an observer, we can talk about various discontinuous methods for assessing behavior. And really, when we look at the literature, there's a pretty wide variety. We'll talk really briefly about three in terms of whole interval, partial interval, and momentary time sampling. So whole interval, and students in my interventions in schools class have seen this description. Let's say we have a behavior. Let's say we're interested in off-task or disruptive behavior of a student. And here on that top timeline, we have 10-second intervals. So with whole interval recording, what we would do is divide a time period up, let's say a class period. It could be 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever that might be, into smaller segments. And in this case, we've done 10-second intervals. And what we will do is we will record a behavior as occurring if it is observed for the entire duration of an interval. Okay, so looking at this, and we'll really just consider the first, let's say 30 seconds for this. Looking at this, we could look at interval 1 from 0 to 10 seconds and say off-task behavior occurred right at the end, but it didn't occur during the whole interval, so we would score that interval as a non-occurrence. Our second interval from 10 to 20 seconds, off-task behavior was demonstrated during the whole thing, and we would say, okay, that was an occurrence of behavior per whole interval recording. And then from 20 to 30 seconds, off-task behavior didn't fill up the whole interval, so we're going to score that as a non-occurrence. And we would say overall, off-task behavior per this data collection method occurred 33% of the time. And if we looked at this, I would say that's probably somewhat of maybe an underestimate of the actual occurrence of on-task behavior over this first 30 seconds. At least visually, take that bar. It's probably a little bit more than that. So partial interval is somewhat similar. We'll look at those same data. And now what we're doing is scoring an interval as behavior having occurred if it occurred at any point during the interval. So we could look at interval 0 to 10 and say, yeah, there was a little off-task behavior, so that's an occurrence. 10 to 20, an occurrence, and 20 to 30, that's an occurrence as well. So using this system, we would say off-task behavior occurred during 100% of the time. And again, like eyeballing that bar of off-task data, we would probably say that's not really right either. That really overestimated the duration of off-task behavior for this particular student. Our final alternative, we have momentary time sampling. And for this method, we would score a behavior as occurring for an interval if it occurred right at the very end of an interval. So we look at right at 10 seconds and we can see off-task behavior is occurring. Right at 20 seconds, we see it's occurring. And then right at 30 seconds, it's not occurring. So our estimate here would be 66%, which in this case, I think is probably the closest of the three estimates that we got there. And overall research really supports this method, momentary time sampling, as being the least likely to give you a biased estimate of student behavior, whether we're talking about a behavior of duration, if we're interested in how frequently behavior is occurring, we're more likely to have valid estimates given momentary time sampling. So in most cases in a school setting, good data-based decision making starts with good data collection, and in many cases momentary time sampling is going to be a good alternative for the majority of behaviors which you might be interested in a classroom setting. Alternatively, and this doesn't work for all of our behaviors, but for some, we could consider things like permanent products. So some behaviors will make a permanent change in the environment when they occur. And that's really great because then we can go and measure a behavior after the fact. So you could come back to a classroom at the end of the day and see that a behavior has occurred. And this can be challenging. We could think about this in a lot of different ways. So for hand washing, you might be able to measure a permanent product and if you had a soap dispenser and you could measure how much soap has been used per day, and that is a permanent product. You don't have to be there measuring how much soap is in students' hands. You could look at the bottle at the end of the day and say, this is how much soap has been used. With work completion, you could look at worksheets and the number of problems completed. You don't need to be there, over a student's shoulder watching them fill out problems. You can check that at the end of the day. Out of seat behavior, this one is challenging, but if you had a school with, great maybe video technology and you could, hop in and view a student on a video, that might be a way to look at student behavior after the fact. It's challenging in a lot of cases. Many schools might not have that technology in place. There are certainly concerns with things like confidentiality and consent with video recording. But there are lots of ways in which you could observe a behavior after the fact. But in general, when we're interested in behavior of a single student, we really should be thinking of that momentary time sampling as a good method that allows us to make valid decisions. In some cases, we may be interested in group behavior too. And predominantly, we have kind of two methods for assessing behavior at the classroom level. It could be an individual group or and then we can look at fixed and random methods. And we'll really just quickly look at some demonstrations of what these look like in classrooms. So if we were interested in generating like classroom estimates of behavior, let's say of on-task behavior, of academic engagement and something like this, we could measure classroom in such a way where we might look at one student during our first interval and say, oh, student 1 is on task. Then the next interval, we look at student 2 and 3 and 4 and so forth, and record what each student is doing during that particular interval. And then we could sum up across all students and create an average for a classroom. And we could do it in a fixed way, going row by row. We could also do that in a random way, jumping all around the classroom to create an estimate. And research would suggest those individual random and individual fixed methods are really similar in the estimates that they produce. We could also consider behavior in more of a group method. So here we have students sitting in rows. We could look at the behavior of all 3 students in this particular row. Using group methods, all students have to be demonstrating the same behavior for it to be scored as an occurrence. So here we had 2 students that are on task and 1 that's off. So we would score all students as off task. Same with the second row and third row. So looking at this, really quickly, I think we can realize there's some problems with this. In each row, we tend to have 2 students that are on task and only 1 that are off task. But our estimate at the end is that all students are off task all the time. So we should begin to see that we're really severely underestimating occurrences of behavior. And doing it in a random way doesn't necessarily help either. We're really underestimating how much behavior is occurring in a classroom. So for classroom methods, we said for individuals, momentary time sampling is really the way to go. For classes, for groups of individuals, we should be collecting data in a way that consider individual students, going student by student by student, instead of considering groups at a time. Alternatively, and if you're involved in doing things within the UTTEC lab with the components of the successful classroom, you're really familiar with planned activity checks. This is an alternative to those interval methods where we might be looking at a different student, say every 10 to 15 seconds. In a planned activity check, what we do at regular intervals is look and see how many students are demonstrating a target behavior at a particular time. So let's say at the conclusion of our first interval, we scan the classroom and we see student 1 and 2 are on task, student 4 and 6 and 7 and 9 are all on task. We have 6 of 9 students on task. And then in our next interval, we do it again and we scan the classroom and make a tally. Now we have 7 of 9 students that are on task during this interval. And then at the end of our observation period, we would just take an average of all of those intervals of students that demonstrated our target behavior, and it would give us an estimate of class-wide behavior. And the really cool thing about planned activity checks, there was a study done by Dart and colleagues in 2016 that found that doing planned activity checks at 5-minute intervals, so scanning a classroom every 5 minutes and tallying the number of students that are demonstrating a target behavior, was equally valid as looking at a different student every 15 seconds. So there's a huge difference in the term in, I guess, with respect to the amount of demand placed on a data collector. And the really cool thing is that collecting data at 5-minute intervals instead of 15-second intervals potentially enables general education teachers who have this huge demand of teaching a classroom to be able to collect data on how their classroom is engaged academically. It may not require, an additional external observer to come in and collect data, which really facilitates school-wide and class-wide decision-making. So very cool. Planned activity checks certainly facilitating good database decision-making in schools, at least at that classroom level. All right, so we've gotten kind of all of those prerequisites out of the way. Now we've collected data. What do we do with it? How do we set ourselves up to make a good decision about those data? Our first step should really be presenting the data to stakeholders. And typically that comes in the form of a graph. And we see lots of different kinds of graphs created. In most cases, line graphs are going to be the most appropriate because they allow us to represent data change over time. There's this great quote by Parsonson and Baer that we have pulled up here. Graphs can and usually do transform the data as minimally as possible. And that is really, really critical. We, again, want to present data that are free of bias, free of, presenting it in some lens through the kind of perspective of the observer. So it really allows independent decision-making by all stakeholders involved. And a great thing about graphs as well is that they're really easy to understand. They don't require, a background in statistics. Most individuals, you can look at a graph and really quickly understand what's going on, regardless of whether you're a professional in a school, whether you are a layperson, whether you are a caregiver. Everyone can look at a graph and really understand that quickly. So there's a couple really essential elements of presenting data in a graph. And we have our x-axis, which presents kind of units of time and units of measurement. We have our y-axis, which presents levels of a behavior. Typically, when we're looking at a graph, we should be including a phase change line, which we'll see on kind of this next slide. We separate data collected pre-intervention and post-intervention with a line, makes it really easy to distinguish. We have condition labels, which tell us here was before intervention, here was after intervention. And then we have our data points and our data paths. And these are elements that should be in every single graph that we present. And we already have this quote from Parsonson and Baer just to present it one more time and really, really re-emphasize that. So we have this graph, we have our data. How do we make a decision based on that? We could then apply some statistical analyses. There are lots of strategies that have been developed over the past 10 to 15 years in statistically evaluating data of single students. And again, those require some background knowledge. They're not immediately approachable to everyone involved. Instead, when we present data in a graph, we should be looking at these kind of visual and analytic elements of trend, level, variability, overlap, and immediacy. And we'll look at all of those individually here. So first off, we have changes in level. So here in this baseline phase, I've drawn this red line across these data that show the mean of data in this baseline phase. Then we have our phase change line, and we go to this condition called the GBG, or good behavior game. And what we can do is we can look and see that there was an increase in the mean of behavior across these two phases. So that leads us to think, yes, this intervention to some degree was effective. It increased the average level of behavior. In this withdrawal phase, we took away the intervention. We see behavior decrease. And then the good behavior game, we see it hop back up and behavior returns to high levels. All right, so that's a really easy way to consider data. Just look at the average across different phases. However, alone, it kind of paints an incomplete picture. Next, we could consider trend. During baseline, we see that data are slightly decreasing over time. They kind of start a little higher in baseline, and over time towards 0.7, they're kind of steadily going down. We implement the good behavior game and we see behavior start to trend upwards. We remove intervention, we see a really sharp decrease in behavior and behavior trending downwards. And then in that last good behavior game phase, we see kind of a slight decreasing trend, but certainly not as sharp as the previous withdrawal phase. So we can look at these changes in trend and we see behavior decreasing and then suddenly behavior increasing. That leads us to believe there's something going on. We changed that trajectory of behavior, which supports that what we were doing was effective. Then we can look at variability. In baseline here, I think the easiest way to do this is draw what's called an envelope over the highest data point and below the lowest data point in a phase. And we can see the amount of space that data take up. And ideally, we're probably looking for a decrease in the size of that envelope from baseline to good behavior game. Our lines get a little closer together, our two red lines. We go to withdrawal and those red lines get farther apart. In our last good behavior game phase, we see those red lines come together. And again, this is supporting conclusions about the efficacy of our intervention in changing student behavior. In this case, student academically engaged behavior, that student behavior is less variable when our class-wide intervention is implemented. Then we can look at overlap across phases. So in this one, in baseline, we're going to draw a red line across from our highest data point in baseline. And then we're going to look at the number of data points that are above that in the good behavior game. And we can see that there are 3 points that kind of reach new heights in kind of this good behavior game condition. We can do the opposite when we take away interventions and look at how many data points are below our lowest one. And we see we take away the good behavior game and suddenly all our data points are below, or we see less on-task behavior than we had ever seen when the good behavior game was in place. We could do the same thing with withdrawal, draw a data point from our highest data point, draw a line from our highest data point, see how many data points lie above that. And we see that all of the data points in that final phase are above the highest point in withdrawal, suggesting that intervention really and consistently changed student behavior in that classroom. Then we can look at immediacy, and this one is really easy to look at. We just kind of look how much of a change is prevalent from the last data point of one phase to the first data point of our next one. So from baseline to intervention, how big is that jump when we go from baseline to good behavior game? When we move from good behavior game to withdrawal and we take away that intervention, we see a really substantial decrease. When we go from withdrawal to the good behavior game, we see a huge increase. That red line right there is really substantial. All right, so our final piece, we kind of look at these 5 really critical elements about data. But really, to make a good decision, we need to make sure that those data and those graphs are presented in such a way that they support your decision making in an evidence-based way. Johnson and Pennypacker have this great quote. It's important to interpret graphic data without being influenced by, it's impossible to interpret graphic data without being influenced by various characteristics of the graph itself. So by presenting data similar to using a statistic to interpret data, we are passing our data through some lens, and that colors interpretations of individuals. So just by plugging your data into Excel and taking that graph that Excel spits out, that is going to influence the decisions that you make in some way or another. And what we do know is that in both published research and applied practice, there is incredible variability in the way that practitioners and researchers make graphs. And ultimately, there's this question: does this matter? Even if we're coloring our data through these various graphs, does that really influence how people make decisions and make good decisions? So here we have some data, and I want you to look at this. These are the percentage of intervals of disruptive behavior of a single student in a classroom. And we can see during baseline, this student was disruptive, look at that around 35% or so, and then look at those trends and those changes in data. Consider things like changes in level, immediacy of effect, trend in data. And we did a study where we showed school psychology faculty this graph, and pretty consistently they looked at this and said that there was a small effect, many even saying there was really no notable effect in these data for this student's behavior. It was, from their perspective, using visual analysis, kind of a null effect. Our intervention was not successful. Then we showed them this graph, and we said, same thing, this is a student's behavior in a classroom. It's disruptive behavior. And they looked at these data and decided that these, represented kind of a small to moderate effect. Okay. And, looking at these, again, consider things like variability, level, trend, immediacy of effect. You might come to that same decision and, be consistent with what lots of these school psychology faculty members said. Really, these data are exactly the same. They are presented on graphs that are constructed differently, but they depict the same data, right? But they look really different, and they lead individuals, even individuals with a lot of expertise in single case design and visual analysis, to make different decisions. So right off the bat, what has changed? We can see the percentage of intervals. On this graph, it's scaled from 0 to 40%. On this graph, it's scaled from 0 to 100%. So you can influence individuals' decisions they're making based on the scaling of data. And for this student, if you presented a school-based team with these data, they might say, this intervention was unsuccessful, we need to change it. If you presented them with these data, they might say, oh, it's having a moderate effect, we should continue in that intervention. And those are very different decisions that have very real impacts on the supports that students are receiving. And it has nothing to do with the intervention itself and everything to do with how those data were presented to stakeholders, which is kind of a scary thought, that a graph and the way a graph is formatted could potentially influence student service delivery and what a student receives in terms of supports in a school. So what we know from that study is, when we're talking about percentage data, we need to be displaying that full range. It's better to be conservative in our estimates in most cases than to be liberal and say something is effective when it's actually not. Then, let's take a look at these data, and we'll do kind of one more demonstration of how scaling and graphic presentation might change our decision. So here we have academically engaged behavior. We're not going to do any tricks with our y-axis here. So look at this, and you might say, I don't know, this might represent like a moderate effect. You see from baseline to that CP phase, there's a pretty substantial increase in level. Withdrawal, there's a nice decreasing trend. In our last CP phase, there's another increase in level over time. So look at this, then look at these data. Here again, you know my trick now. These are the same data, and what we have essentially done is just kind of stretched out the x-axis on that. And we did this, and we showed practitioners these data, and researchers these data, and consistently researchers rated this graph as demonstrating a larger effect than this graph. And there's probably a variety of factors that do that. It really accentuates immediacy of change. It kind of accentuates variability within data. But again, the way that we scale a graph and kind of stretch it out or press it together makes practitioners and researchers either overestimate the effect of an intervention or kind of underestimate or more accurately estimate the effect to which an intervention had on student behavior. Here are two more examples, and I think this really emphasizes this. Again, these are the same data. Looking at those data on the left, you might look at those and say, that's not really impressive. The changes look somewhat gradual. We can press those really tightly together. And individuals said consistently, and again, these are researchers with lots of training and lots of experience in doing this, nearly everyone said the graph on the right demonstrates a larger effect, even though they are exactly the same data. So again, the way that you are constructing a graph in schools influences the decisions you make about student progress and the interventions that a student may or may not receive. So we call this phenomenon the DPP-XYR, or the data points per X to Y axis ratio. So if you take a ruler out and you measure how long the X axis is, how long the Y axis is, and we have the formula there, divide the length of the X by the length of the Y by the total number of data points that are indicated along the X axis, and it gives you a number. And ideally, that number should be 0.14 or greater. The lower that number is, you see more compression, and individuals tend to start overestimating how effective an intervention is at that point. So that's kind of a reasonable cut point. And again, currently there's no tool to kind of automatically calculate what the DPP-XYR is of a graph that you create. But we should be thinking about these things when we're putting data into Excel and it's spitting out a graph. Excel does not care about this. It's just giving you a graph. But it requires you as a school-based practitioner to format your graph in such a way that will enable your team to make good database decisions about your student. Here's one more that we'll really quickly look at. We can look at data in this way or this way. And we, again, did a study. People looked at these data and said, this looks like a smaller effect. This looks like a larger effect. And all we've changed is our labeling of the axis. Sometimes when we collect data, we put it like right next to each other and we say this was session 1, 2, 3, 4, even though those sessions may have occurred, days or weeks apart. So in presenting data and clearly communicating data, and in order to make a good evidence-based decision, we should be presenting data in such a way that really represents that passage of time and clearly communicates that. All right, and this all has to do with this idea of temporal relations and clearly understanding how long of time occurs between two data points. Finally, we'll look at one last little trick that folks might encounter and that really impedes database decision-making in schools is this practice of collapsing data or putting data points together. So let's say you were, running some kind of group or session with an individual student. You could take data on a by session level. You could take it on a much more intensive schedule. You could take it maybe on an opportunity level. So if, let's say you were running a social skills group, which I do a lot of, you might give in each social skills group a student, 10 opportunities to role play a skill. And you could take data on each one of those role plays, right? And say, here are the number of steps they did and present it that way, or you could present it for the whole day. And these data kind of model that. And what we found is that when individuals look at data, when there's so much like this and it's by individual trial, maybe this becomes overwhelming for people. And people tend to make poor decisions based on data that have so much data to consider. When we present data on this more by session or by day level, people tend to make better decisions. So we do think it's important to represent data as clearly as possible, but collapse it to a level that makes it understandable and digestible, but not overly so. When we go to this idea of like by week, this becomes much more difficult to interpret. You could look at this and say, wow, that looks like a really big difference. These are those same data. We just smush them more together. We made the days into weeks. These are all the same. And people tend to really overestimate when you create data based on weeks and months. But if you present, individual day or individual session, that's usually a really good practice for database decision making. All right, so collapse data to a reasonable extent. Don't present so much that it's overwhelming, but session and day provides like this good balance of data and readability. So just since we're really close to the end, I want to jump to this last quote and then turn over the last couple minutes for questions. There's this really interesting study done by Sullivan and colleagues, and they presented vignettes which varied by like student race and disability status and the amount of data that was included. And what Sullivan and colleagues found that there was kind of these inconsistent demonstrations of disparities by things like race and disability status. However, individuals overall really neglected data in both scenarios, whether they had a lot of racial data, they had a lot of disability status data about a student. Individuals just weren't using data effectively regardless. And that's, really, really concerning. I guess, we can take some heart in this particular sample. It didn't look like there was, racial or, disability bias, but certainly kind of this data literacy element was huge, that the decisions seemed to be just kind of inconsistent and random in lots of ways. And then there was this other really cool study done in 2019 by Schildkamp, who looked at data-based decision-making by school leaders. And what they found, we have this quote here, was that individuals tended to make what they called intuitive decisions or gut decisions, and those were more valued than data-based decisions. And again, that's really scary that people are very much practicing by their gut and how they think things are going instead of by data, which, we would assume to be, very reliable and valid in representing data. So both really cool studies, but both, 2019, this is not that long ago to say, oh, we've really improved since then. I don't think we have that much. Data literacy is a huge concern. And it really begins with, again, those principles of how do we define behavior? How do we collect data in a valid and reliable way? And then how do we interpret those data in a way that supports or represents what actually occurred in that classroom? All right, so to, again, summarize everything, really rely on rational data instead of intuitive data. We should be collecting data in all that we do, and really considering kind of this whole process of everything that leads up to the point where we're making a decision is really supporting data-based decision-making and being critical for the decisions that we will make to support students in schools. All right, so on that note, we have just maybe a couple minutes before we end the webinar. Are there any questions that folks have?
I don't have questions, but I want to say, this is such an important topic, and I have to say, I'm done with grad school, but there's so much that I learned just by looking at this. And I think graphing is so important. I have a secret affection with graphs, just editing things and moving things around. But I want to also appreciate, I love your PowerPoint. I think just the graphic portion of it. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, I think, this is something that, we had collected some data and from practitioners. I think people generally reported when they create graphs, you just drop data into Excel and you don't really think about it more than that. When in reality, like you said, a lot of thought needs to go into how we're presenting data so that, people can make good decisions, and decisions that are made based on data and not by, your gut or by all of these other, factors that may be influencing you.
Keith, I really appreciated that the last slide, or second to last slide, where we talked about the data literacy. And I just think that's such an important piece that I didn't conceptualize in that way. Just it's such a privilege to be able to know how to interpret data and make inferences from that. And, we're all lucky, I think, through our education, having got that, but it's so important. And, it makes me think now with my own kids, like I need to pull out some graphs and just like have them start understanding these things, on a basic level, but it's really important.
Yeah, but I do think it, like that Shield Camp study really emphasizes that I think individuals are just really confident in their ability to make good decisions in the absence of looking at data. That, whether you're an administrator, a teacher, a school psychologist, you may feel like you have a really good sense of what's going on and that you can, I guess, kind of fly by the seat of your pants in a way, right? And what that suggests is no, like you can't. There needs to be, again, this idea of like valid and reliable data, which I think, fits in like these broader ideas of like equity and justice and making good decisions that are, free of any coloring and free of like your own perspective and how your gut reacts to things to, really best support students. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. If you have any questions, here's my contact information. We'll occasionally put some stuff out on Twitter, probably not as much as other people. I'm not the most active tweeter out there, but, do, follow. We occasionally try to put out some cool stuff about database decision making in schools and graphing, and certainly something that I get really nerdy about, and I'm glad that some other people here do as well.
Thank you so much, Keith. That was a really informative presentation. This presentation is recorded and will be published on the UTTEC lab website, which you can access by going to www.u-tteclab.com. And yeah, thank you again, everybody, so much for joining us and participating.